Well, I knew that she showed back up, but I didn't know.
We got money.
No, we're fine. But yeah, let's start to talk about a few other people. But yeah, Colonel Bruce was certainly a Kentucky blue blood, and his sister married
Rebecca married John Hunt Morgan.
Rebecca married John Hunt Morgan. Yes, so we definitely have a commander of this brigade with real approved lineage for Kentucky.
Business partners and everything.
Now another thing about him is, and another thing that's important about Kentucky is, and the men that will make up these units, both the Confederate Kentucky Brigade, which we were just talking about, and this brigade and many of the others, is that we need to harken all the way back to the fall of 1859 and the attack on Harper's Ferry by John Brown and his militant abolitionist folks. John Brown, as we all remember, attacked Harper's Ferry, had the intention of inciting a slave rebellion, and expected that all the enslaved people in the South would rise up and create a liberation war to set all the slaves free. Now that had a lot more effect than just on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, or Charlestown, Virginia, or all the places that we read about when we talk about that. That was a nationally, a national story, and a nationally traumatic story, especially in the slave-holding states. It was a very traumatic story. So by the summer of 1860, when this presidential campaign gets into high gear, and there's going to be the 4 candidates in the presidential campaign. Only one of them is Abraham Lincoln, representing the Republican Party. Kentuckian John C. Breckinridge, representing the most radical slaveholding part of the Democrat Party. But one of the results of the John Brown raid is the slaveholding states all anticipated more attempts by radical abolitionists to start a slave war. Not the Civil War that later occurred, but an insurrection of slaves. And as a result, in Kentucky, they formed a state militia, a state army. Now they already had a militia, like all the states were legally obliged to have. But in the summer of 1860, the militia all came together and had an encampment, a summer-long encampment. They appointed General Simon Bolivar Buckner as the commander of the, I believe they called it the Kentucky State Guard. And all of these Kentuckians got together and spent the entire summer organizing and training, electing their commanders, all of the things that would happen in the next summer on the fly, with the other volunteer regiments in the other states. Kentuckians all did this in the summer of 1860 during the presidential campaign. And Sanders Bruce was the adjutant general of that force. So he worked directly with General Simon Bolivar Buckner to organize and train these Kentuckians to defend Kentucky against a abolitionist attack that they expected would come. That attack did not come, but Abraham Lincoln won the election. Therefore, the secession crisis started, and that led inevitably is not the word I want to use right now, but we shouldn't argue that in the rain. But that led to Civil War. And when Civil War came, the various Kentuckians of various ideologies, points of view on the war, many of them were already well trained and prepared to organize new regiments, Union or Confederate, and take them to the field. It's one of the reasons why that Kentucky Brigade, later known as the that Kentucky Confederate Brigade, later known as the Orphan Brigade, was so effective. It was really based on men that had been anticipating war since the summer of 1860 and preparing for it. And the same thing goes for these 1st and 2nd Kentucky Regiment men. Even though they were scorned by many in their homes, a lot of them were the men that came out in the summer of 1860. And when the summer of 1861 came and they needed to make a choice, Union or Confederate, they wanted to make the Union choice, and they went across the river. They went across the Ohio River. And so when we look at the 1st and 2nd Kentucky, we have to look at it in terms of these. A lot of these are the same men that trained side by side with the Orphan Brigade men the summer before. So they're going to be very capable guys. And Sanders Bruce was expected to be a very capable commander, later became controversial. We might have a chance to talk about that later. But we want to introduce another character to the story, and a very, very important one is during the time of Kentucky neutrality, before the Confederates violated Kentucky neutrality, both sides, both Confederacy and Union, were very interested in instigating within the state of Kentucky, organizing within the neutral state of Kentucky for their side. And so one of the most important agents on behalf of President Abraham Lincoln and the Union side was a former naval officer named William Nelson. A huge man. William Nelson is well over 6 feet tall and 300 pounds. They called him Bull. Wow. William Bull Nelson. And it's funny to think of William Bull Nelson being a spy. It's too big to fly. But no, he was an agent. He was always an agent during the summer of 1861, and he organized what were called Kentucky Home Guard units, little local militia units whose jobs were to maintain law and order for the Union, all within Kentucky. And Nelson was very effective in smuggling arms from the Union, from Ohio, across the river to these home guards. And so they were ready ready to protect the state if the Confederates came, and at the same time, if the Confederates came, ready to solidify by force Union control over communities in Kentucky, and then ultimately to flock to the colors and form new Kentucky regiments as quickly as they can. And so Nelson is successful in this, and it earns him a brigadier general star in the Union Army. And so by the fall of 1861 and the winter of 1862, he was a brigadier general commanding the 4th Division of General John Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio. The 22nd Brigade, these 3 Kentucky regiments, were a component of Nelson's division. Now, we don't have time to take them all the way from Bowling Green to Savannah, but I think most of you know the story of Fort Donelson and Fort Henry and the collapse of Albert Sidney Johnston's line. Buell and his army advanced to Nashville, and then they march overland from Nashville to Savannah. And on the morning of April 6, 1862, these men are up here in Savannah. Nelson's division, including the 22nd Brigade, is in Savannah. The cannons fire. Grant hightails it down up to Pittsburgh Landing. Nelson gets his orders to march his division overland to a position opposite Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. So at about noon, between noon and 1, it took them a long time to find a local guide. About noon or 1, they take off, marching as fast as they can from Savannah. They know from the locals that they are going to have to cross through an enormous overgrown swamp. That's the low ground on the east side of the Tennessee River. And if you've driven around down there, you know that there's a lot of low ground, a lot of bottomland down there. And it was wet at the time. It had been raining. It was wet and spongy, and it was also overgrown. The trails had been overgrown. There were not really any roads down there. So they got a guide to take them, and one of the companies of the 2nd Kentucky Regiment, a company under command of a captain named Jacob Hurd Smith, were given axes and spades. And Smith called his company the Kentucky Axemen. And they took the lead. They were the pioneers. And then as Nelson's division hit that low ground and plowed into those bushes and those thorns and so on, the Kentucky Axemen took the lead, cutting through and cutting the trail for Nelson's army to make that Nelson's division to make that last few miles to the bank of the Tennessee River opposite Pittsburgh Landing so that they could cross over. It was very heavy work. It was very heavy work, and for every single one of those infantrymen in Nelson's division, it was a very tough march. In and out of the mud every step of the way, struggling through those bottomlands. Another soldier that made that march was Sergeant Ambrose Bierce of the 9th Indiana Regiment. He called it a killing march. He remembered men falling out to die by the side of the road. One presumes that those were, sick men who were trying to get into the battle and accompany their companies. But Bierce remembered men just falling out and dying by the side of the road before they even got to the battlefield. So hard was that last part of the march through the bottomlands east of the Tennessee River. But they got there, evening of April 6, 1862, crossed over on steamboats, ferried across the river to Pittsburgh Landing, and then took their place in line of battle about half a mile on the other side of Dill Branch Ravine from this monument, and placed themselves in line of battle. They got there too late to actually burn powder in that final engagement, but their Colonel Sanders Bruce brought them to their position. Their position, with respect to the organization of Nelson's division, was the middle, was the center of the division. On their left were 3 regiments of the brigade of Colonel Jacob Ammon, and to their right were 3 regiments of the brigade of Colonel William Babcock Hazen. And the 3 brigades would maintain this relationship for the entire battle. So during the course of the battle, Bruce will continue to be the center of Nelson's division, Hazen the right, Ammon the left. Dawn of April 7th, 1862. Just like this. The Union Army moves forward. Nelson's division moves forward. Nelson's division precedes the rest of the army forward. Very enthusiastic about going forward. So the army, that division, would move across this entire field. So let's move back to Cloud Field for a moment before we pick up the next leg of our journey.
The whole second day's on the other side.
Okay.
Brigade would have made. We were pretty much in Ammon's area when we were at the monument. But the Cloud Field is a terrific opportunity for us to look and see the first stage of Nelson's advance. Like I said, Nelson's division anticipated the advance of the rest of the army. General Nelson was pretty fast on the trigger. He wanted to get into that fight fast. And so at about, before 6:30 in the morning of April 6th, he pushed his division up out of Dill Branch Ravine with skirmishers well forward. You know, anytime a large division or anytime a body of troops moves forward in line of battle, they would put skirmishers out ahead. And so the skirmishers would have topped this hill right here, come right into the field. The field does, as you see, the field does crest in the middle. The road is not graded up. The road is just laid on top of the existing land. And so this field does crest. And so as Nelson's division crested that rise, they came under the fire of skirmishers, Confederate skirmishers in the north side of the field, dismounted cavalry. And then the Union skirmishers came here, and so we had a skirmish fight across this field, and the line of battle stopped, halted, and stood there and waited for the rest of the army to come up. Now the rest of the army wouldn't come up and join them on the right flank until about 8 o'clock. So there's going to be that'll be a characteristic of the Union advance, especially in Buell's army on April 7th. A slow and methodical advance, but with all of the units trying to make sure that they keep contact with the unit on the right and the unit on the left. They do this with more or less success, because we're going to see some examples during the course of our walk where they're notably unsuccessful in maintaining a contiguous line of battle. The Confederates get the credit for doing that to the Union Army. But the first stage, here we are, this is the first stage of Nelson's advance, and Bruce and his troops would have been right here in the middle. Another military characteristic of this advance that reflects on by-the-book conservatism in Buell's army is every single unit keeps a reserve. Every single brigade commander holds back part of his brigade as a reserve. Now, each of these 3 brigades is comprised of 3 regiments. So that means each of the 3 brigades is advancing with 2 regiments forward and 1 regiment back. And the regiment in reserve is positioned in the middle, you know, like with their colors right behind where the 2 front regiments come together. So in Bruce's brigade, the alignment is the 1st Kentucky Regiment on the right in the front line, the 2nd under Lieutenant Colonel David Enyart, the 2nd Kentucky Regiment on the left under command of Colonel Tom Sedgwick, and the 20th Kentucky in reserve under Colonel Hanson, Lieutenant Colonel Hanson, with Colonel Bruce of the 20th in command of the whole brigade. When they do advance across, when they do get into the advance, it's with skirmishers forward and fighting against Confederate skirmishers, because the Confederate commanders are doing the same thing, throwing out skirmishers to feel out in front of the army, and then only after the skirmishers are driven in do the 2 main lines of battle come to close range and start fighting. One of the things that stops General Nelson and his division repeatedly during the course of the day is that he is moving south. He comes out of Dill Branch Ravine and is moving south, whereas the rest of Buell's army keeps moving to the south and the west. It's the nature of this battlefield, right? We have the Tennessee River going north-south, but Owl Creek way over there is going from southwest to northeast. So as Buell's army goes forward with Grant on the right, the Union Army continues to stretch to the right. And that means every time Nelson advances and loses contact on the right, he stops and he waits for the next troops on the right to come up. In this case, it's the division of General Thomas Crittenden. So by the time they, by the mid-morning of April 7th, Nelson can move forward from this position because Crittenden has come up and joined him on the right over there in the Hills Hollow area, and Crittenden is starting to shake out his 2 brigades so that they can join Nelson on the right. So we're going to go back where we came from, but we're going to get some different scenery. Let's cut through this trail right here, and if I don't get us lost, we'll come back out into Wicker Field in just a few minutes.
A couple more Kentucky connections here. For Crittenden, Kentucky, Charles Hazen of the 20th Kentucky is the brother of Roger Hazen, who commands the 2nd Kentucky Confederate. At this point, resides in Fort Moore, Massachusetts, having been captured at Fort Donelson.
That's right. That's right.
He'll later be killed at Murfreesboro, commanding the Orphan Brigade.
Right. And you're going to see this. You're going to see this throughout the service of these troops. You know, stuff that sounds really, I guess we'd use irony, you know, ironic to us, but it probably wouldn't to them. My brother fights for the other side. He just does. That's the side he chose.
I believe Thomas Wood commanded the Federal Division under Nelson. Arthur Buell was, I think, a childhood friend of Simon Bolivar Buckner. They're both from Hart County, Mumfordsville, Kentucky.
Right. And as we already said, Bruce and Buckner, very close associates of their own. I don't know whether they liked each other or not, but they worked together very closely. All right. Ben Hart and Helmet. Captured. Right. Reed was raised well. If you say something nice, don't say nothing at all. I don't think he's younger than camp of Myers Battery, Myers, Ohio Battery. They had quit the field early on April 6, 1862, and so this battery camp would likely have been empty, deserted, except for any Confederates Confederate wounded that might have come in and stayed here, or maybe died here on the evening before. Think in terms of all of the wastage of battle, from the first day. And Ambrose Bierce, our sergeant from the 9th Indiana, tells us about that. You know, all of the dead animals laying around, all of the broken and shattered wagons around this area. Being a battery, you might have seen a destroyed forge. You know, the blacksmith forges that artillery batteries would carry around with them. Artillery batteries had a blacksmith with them and a whole team. And artillery companies were authorized 119 horses. Of course, a lot of those horses went with Myers Battery out to the peach orchard and got killed there, but a lot of others might have been killed around here. Of course, wounded and dead men lying around. all of the tents, all of the knapsacks, all of the sacked out quartermaster and commissary stores, sutlers wagons. You know, these sutlers were the merchants that got contracts to travel with the regiments and with the batteries and sell their goods and wares to the soldiers. And indeed, these would have been either sacked by the Confederates or torn out and thrown around. Everything soaked in mud, everything trampled into the mud. And now, as the regiment moves, as these Kentucky regiments move across this area, first the skirmishers and then the line of battle, just plodding through all of this soaked, dead, bloody, muddy waste of war. And as they crossed this ground, the skirmishers ahead would have moved into the northern end of Wicker Field. To our right, the skirmishers of Hazen's 19th Brigade, moving out of those woods into North Wicker Field. And beyond Hazen's Brigade, once again, open space. So once again, a need to cease advancing and stop the line of battle while Crittenden comes up and closes on the right. We're ready to head up to the field?
So if they're camped in here, these woods have to be a quarter of what they are now.
Oh yes. Oh yes, especially in this area. Imagine only the large trees standing, if that. And anything at all that was either not just underbrush but small trees would have been taken by the soldiers for fuel. This had been a camp for about 3 weeks before the battle.
But even before that, people lived here and they had animals roaming free too.
Yeah, right.
So
Right.
It was pretty open landing for the soldiers back then.
Right.
Uh-huh.
And what trees are here, they use for fuel.
Right. Right. So there would have been plenty of room for Myers to set up his camp here, and then for his batterymen to start gathering fuel and clearing out the undergrowth. All right. You okay, Kurt?
Yeah, yeah.
Give it a shot. Okay. We found the position where Nelson's division eventually found their enemies. Now, as we know from before, as soon as they crested Dill Branch Ravine and came out into Cloud Field, there were dismounted Confederate cavalry to pop off a few shots at them. And there was some light skirmishing across that field early in the morning, and they had to wait. They had to wait until Crittenden came up on their right. And then even once they started moving, with skirmishers well ahead, Nelson's division started to move very slowly across the landscape. So even if they moved ahead at 8 or 9 in the morning, they wouldn't have arrived in this position until between 9 and 10. Like maybe an hour to cover that, you know, those, what was that, a quarter mile, half mile that we just walked across. Now the wood lines here in the field are pretty similar to what they were. So in advancing this far, Nelson would stop in the wood line. He would stop in the wood line because there's nothing that more effectively stops a Civil War line of battle, no mighty may it be, than an open field. There's nothing that can stop an army faster than a question mark. What is ahead of us? So, Nelson would have brought his division right up to the edge of this field, and since the division stopped, the left-hand brigade under Colonel Ammon over here in the woods would have stopped, sent forward skirmishers. Skirmishers would likely have found Confederate skirmishers, and we would have had skirmish fighting, you know, that low-intensity fighting off here in the woods. Same thing happening here in the field. Now in the field, imagine Colonel Hazen's brigade brought up along this wood line, Colonel Bruce's brigade, the 1st Kentucky, and then the 2nd Kentucky in the woods here. The line stops, and they see in front of them, something similar to what we see in front of us, an open field. To the right of Hazen's brigade, there isn't anybody. But first, the first question to be answered is what's on the other side of that field? The only way to answer that question is somebody has to go see. And so they deploy skirmishers, 2 or 3 companies per regiment. 2 companies of the 1st Kentucky deployed as skirmishers in the area where we're standing now. The skirmishers move across the field. Now, a skirmish line is a company deployed out in loose formation, about 6 feet between each soldier, and then behind the front skirmish line, a platoon in reserve. So imagine, this would be in a perfect circumstances, imagine a company of 100 men with a captain commanding it, and the colonel comes to the captain and says, "Captain, you're on skirmish duty. Go see what's on the other side of that field." That means he would deploy one of his 2 platoons, according to Civil War Hardy's Tactics organization of the Army. One of the 2 platoons, 50 men, would deploy with 6 feet apart. The other platoon, a reserve to the skirmish line, deployed in close order, elbow to elbow, following up behind them, and then behind the reserve, the main line of battle. And so those skirmishers move out into this field. And so if you want to imagine that skirmish line moving out into the field slowly, silence to the front, not knowing exactly what might be in that wood line, you've seen the line of skirmishers, 1st Kentucky here, 9th Indiana next, 41st Ohio on the other side of the field, just flowing slowly across that field. One of the sergeants commanding a reserve platoon in the 9th Indiana was Sergeant Bierce, whom we've talked about before. And they move slowly across here. In this case, as Sergeant Bierce remembered, the Confederates, yes, spoiler alert, the Confederates are in the other side of the field. The Confederates permitted the skirmish line to get, as Bierce put it, close enough that they could count our teeth. That the skirmishers got close enough to the other wood line that they could count their teeth. And that's when the Confederates in the wood line rose up from a prone position and fired point blank into the face of the skirmish line. And those skirmishers came tumbling back on the reserve, or rather, Bierce remembered that he tried to push his reserve forward to support the skirmishers, but the skirmishers came back on him, and so they came tumbling back across the field. Some of the men lying dead on that line, others falling as they came running back across the field. Consider it a perfect rout of the skirmish line. They come back across the field and rally upon their main line of battle in the woods right here. What Sergeant Bierce remembered was a young lieutenant who was commanding his company had come back to, the whole company had gotten back here, and the colonel, Colonel Hazen in this case, was sitting on his horse, quietly watching the whole thing go on as though he were observing a Sunday parade or something like that. And they come rushing back and rally upon the main line, and the young lieutenant runs up and salutes Colonel Hazen and says, "Colonel, the enemy are in force on the other side of this field." Thank you, Lieutenant. Thank you for that report, Lieutenant. No kidding. And so, but that's also illustrative of the nature of the battle at this point. Very serious and severe fighting, but it's on this skirmish level. Also, the Confederates had pushed, I think, at least 2 cannon, probably 2 cannon of Robertson's battery, up into that wood line. And once the battle started, they were shooting some artillery over here. Nelson's division did not bring artillery. Why wouldn't they have brought their artillery with them?
Swamp.
The swamp. They knew they were going to be cutting their way through that swamp on the right bank of the Tennessee River. So the artillery was coming forward on the steamboats with General McCook's division, which was the 3rd Division coming up. But General Nelson sent to General Buell, the commander, we need artillery. The Confederates have artillery in front of us. We need artillery. And General Buell got the message. General Nelson's division was the 1st Division of the Army of the Ohio engaged. And so Buell detached a battery of artillery from McCook's division as soon as they came up from Pittsburgh Landing, Mendenhall's battery of regulars, and sent them to the assistance of General Nelson. But right now, all we're talking about right now is General Nelson sending that message. The artillery had not arrived at this point. And so for some time, for 2 reasons, Nelson and his division held steady right here in North Wicker Field. The 2 reasons were Confederates over there, including artillery. We do not have any artillery ourselves. And then also on the right, waiting for Crittenton to come up and tie in on the right. Okay?
Well, it's going to take a couple of hours for the artillery to get from the boat up to here.
You would think so, but those regular artillerists know their job. They move pretty fast.
The swamp to go through though, right?
No, they came down on a steamboat and then...
Well, I know, but after they landed, then don't they have a muddy mess to go through?
Well, yeah, there would still be a road. But yeah, the road would be muddy and messy and awful. Yeah, it would have been an awful challenge for Mendenhall's gunners. And indeed, it took a little time for them to get up here.
They were already offloaded at the landing when the messenger got down there.
As far as I know, yeah. Buell was when Buell got the message, he had artillery at hand. He could say, Mendenhall, take your people out to Nelson and report to Nelson. We're not going to go over there, but those cannon there on the other side of the field represent the position that Mendenhall took when he arrived on the field. And then later he took another position even further to the right.
If he's taking a position that far up, if he's taking a position that far up to begin with, the Confederates must have moved back.
Yes, when Mendenhall arrived.
Okay.
But when Mendenhall arrived, the whole division moved forward.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And so, so when by the time the artillery gets here, the Confederates are ready to surrender that wood line. The Confederates would have considered that what you might call an intermediate line of battle. It's not their main line of battle. You know, they intend to give it up. They just intend to make the Yankees pay for it before they do that. We also have to understand that Ammen is still has his skirmishers out on the left, and he's he's having a lot more success at first than the rest of the division. Ammen is not up against any artillery over there, and so he would be able to send a report saying, hey, General Nelson, we're ready to go if the division is. So let's move forward. Our next stop, let's even use the pavement to make time. Our next stop is the yellow tablet and then the monument to the regulars on the other side of the field.
By this time of day, are the Southerners just trying to maintain the status quo rather than thinking of an assault?
Oh, good idea. Good question. By this time of day,
what time is
in the morning, yeah, we're between 9 and 10 right now.
Pretty early in the day.
It's still early in the day, although Nelson has been trying to get forward since 6:30 in the morning.
But anyway,
by this time of the day, General Beauregard still intends to launch an offensive and destroy Grant's army and finish the battle.
he doesn't realize Buell has.
Oh, well, he's heard Buell has arrived, but he's at least going to take the chance that he can beat Buell. Yeah. And, he could say, well, Buell is arriving, but they might not all be across the river yet. Yeah. So, if he can catch Buell on the move, that's just more fish in the net, if he's successful. So, what we are looking, the Confederates that we're fighting, that Nelson is fighting right now, are Confederates that intend to win the battle. they intend to launch that attack. Now, as the morning went on, they realized they weren't going to win, but they were still going to use the tactic of attacking as a matter of defense. More experienced, better trained army might need a year and a half. And so by 1864, for instance, if we were talking about Sherman's army on the Atlantic campaign, we might see some really impressive field movements with large formations, all responding to the music of the bugle calls. Yeah.
But not here.
No, not here. It's definitely a case of sending a mounted messenger. And if the messenger doesn't get there, neither does the message. So, yeah, Henry, you were asking about time. By the time they arrived, as the tablet tells us, by the time they got across the field and got Mendenhall up here, it was 10 in the morning.
Right.
And and by that time Crittenden was in line on the right, although Crittenden himself was having to advance south and then cover his right. And so that resulted in some aspects of the line being uncovered. In fact, one of the responses that Nelson had to make to the threat to the right being uncovered, was that when they were in this line, Hazen's brigade was bent back and facing to the southwest, while the rest of the army, like this, was facing more or less south. Well, I mean, the road is south, and as you can tell, the tablet is facing maybe 190 degrees or so, just a little west of south. And then over here, Ammon is pretty much facing due south. So all of this is going to continually threaten the division with getting stretched out and taken in the right flank if they don't be careful. And it's another story, but also in the left flank if they don't be careful. Nelson also had to worry about his left flank as he moved forward.
Is that stretched all the way to the river?
It stretched all the way almost all the way to the end of the bluffs, but not into the bottomlands.
Right.
But the bottomlands at this point are not very wide. It's not until we get down past the southern end of the park that the bottomlands stretch out into the swamp. So by 10 o'clock, Bruce is here. And as you can see, 2nd Kentucky is on the left, 1st Kentucky is on the right, 20th Kentucky is in reserve, skirmishers to the front, Confederate skirmishers probably as far advanced as the Peach Orchard, but also by this point, Confederate artillery along the Hamburg-Purdy Road, the main line of resistance, Confederate artillery could start putting a lot of artillery on this position. And that leaves Colonel Bruce, both General Nelson and Colonel Bruce, in a position of having to make some serious decisions that break with the doctrine, the conservative doctrine, that they're trying to maintain. Of two regiments forward, 1 regiment back, a reserve available to the commander at all times, the right flank and the left flank tied in with our neighbors. And of course, the first thing is the Union Army stretching to the right. During this part of the battle, Bruce ordered Colonel Enyart, Lieutenant Colonel Enyart of the 1st Kentucky, to support the 9th Indiana of Hazen's brigade. So Enyart's first mission now became tie-in with the brigade to the right. And that would cause him problems in a little while when the brigade to the right started going to the right and the front, and Enyart and the 1st Kentucky ended following them and fighting off in that position. The second problem was a problem inherent with this artillery. Now, artillery must be supported by infantry. That's the doctrine. And it's a good doctrine, because artillery has a hard time fighting infantry. Now, there's a few minutes if the infantry attacks the artillery. You see it at Gettysburg, where the artillery can spray that canister at them. But by and large, you know, artillery cannot. The worst enemy of the artillery is the sharpshooter. You know, a single infantryman, well hidden, can beat a battery of artillery, knock all the officers off their horses, and then that's that. And so, artillery must be supported by infantry. So, Bruce was compelled to detach the 20th Kentucky to support artillery. Furthermore, he had to detach one of the companies of the 20th Kentucky for skirmish duty elsewhere. So the 20th Kentucky is already reduced in size. And to add on to that, yet another company of the 20th Kentucky had been left behind to guard the baggage of the brigade. And so the 20th Kentucky is getting carved up, and then the 20th Kentucky is being carved out of the regiment, out of the brigade, leaving Bruce without one of his regiments. Let's walk across the road just a few feet right here. The next challenge for Nelson is a challenge he's already had to face once, but now that he's obtained this position and he is exposed to the Confederate main line of battle on the Hamburg-Purdy Road, right over there. And as I said, much more Confederate artillery is now pounding this position, and therefore Nelson again sends for artillery support, and Buell again detaches a battery from elsewhere in the army and sends it to support Nelson. And at about 10 o'clock in the morning, Captain William Terrell's battery arrived at this position to support directly Colonel Bruce and Colonel Ammon out here on the left. And so this battery now needed to be supported by at least a battalion of infantry. And the 20th Kentucky became the support for this battery, which meant they were detached from the brigade. They would have taken a position 100 or 200 yards to the rear here, probably gone prone. Colonel Hazen probably would have put them prone, and there they wait under Confederate bombardment until they get orders to do something else. But you will not see them in the main line of battle for a while. But then a time will come when Bruce will need to call on them and bring them into the front line. But again, if we're talking about 10 o'clock in the morning, now the main line of battle, the Union main line of battle, has moved to here. The skirmishers have moved to the front into the Peach Orchard area. Confederate skirmishers are in front of their line, engaging Union skirmishers, and the artillery Confederate artillery on the Hamburg-Purdy Road, Union artillery here and in Wicker Field are replying, pounding each other across this broad field. Yes?
I guess all this time there are messengers going around from officer to officer telling them what the other superior officer wants to do. And
I would imagine that too.
Are they written messages or just verbal? Or what if
depends.
they get killed on the way?
It depends. Yeah, someone could get killed on the way, exactly. Quite often, the aides de camp and the message carriers would carry verbal messages back and forth. And so a common interaction between the commander that needs to send the message and the messenger that must carry it is that the commander gives the messenger, imagine them both mounted, the commander gives the messenger the messenger must repeat the message back to the commander verbatim to show that he understands it, and then the messenger heads out to deliver it. It may be necessary, and if there are people enough to do it, the commander may give the message to two messengers, and that both of them carry it, and if one is killed, the other, hopefully, makes.
I would think
Makes it.
frequently they would be killed.
And frequently they would be killed. We had one of the reports that we get, a very slim report from Colonel Ed McCook of the 2nd Indiana Cavalry Regiment. He gives a very slim report, and it's simply that he brought his cavalry regiment to the other side of the Tennessee River. He marched them down, and there they waited throughout the day of April 7th, and they never came across, and that was all he had to report. But then he went on to report the only people in the battle were the men who were messengers, cavalrymen from his regiment who were assigned as messengers to the infantry, and then he listed 2 or 3 of them who were wounded in the battle.
Yeah.
So he ended up, the 2nd Indiana Cavalry spent the entire battle on the other side of the river, yet they had 3 casualties at the end of the battle. All right, another question?
I'm sorry. Can you go over again? Where is the main Confederate line of battle? Right here at 10 o'clock.
At this time, at 10 o'clock, the main Confederate line of battle is the Hamburg-Purdy Road.
Purdy Road, and the artillery is
Their artillery is on the
on
Hamburg-Purdy Road.
And then the skirmishers are in between there.
Right, the skirmishers would be out in the field.
Out in the field.
I would expect the trees you're looking at right now are a little ravine called the Mule Lot. And we're going to go there before too long. But it's a little ravine that is between the Hamburg-Purdy Road and the Peach Orchard. And so the Confederate skirmishers, could be down in the Mule Lot, and they could advance up to the top of the lip of that hill and fire with some cover. And then likewise, the Federal skirmishers in the Peach Orchard area can kneel or go prone and use that little rise of ground you see in front of you to cover themselves.
So was the line of the Hamburg-Purdy Road where Beauregard planned to make a stand?
That was where Beauregard planned to make a stand. And Beauregard's, on the strategic scale, Beauregard's next big hope, at about when we're coming up on 10 in the morning, was that General Breckinridge would launch an attack up the center of his line. General William J. Hardee commanded the right of the Confederate Army. It wasn't Hardee's corps. It was various people. But Breckinridge had his whole corps with him. That whole Confederate Reserve Corps, Statham, Martin, and Trabue were all together in the center. And just after 10, they launched that attack. We've talked about the Kentucky Brigade attack earlier today, but also in the center of the Confederate line of battle, around the intersection of the Eastern Corinth and Main and Hamburg-Purdy Road, that's where Statham and Bowen launched attacks right on through the center. Beauregard was intending to attack a major attack with Breckinridge's corps.
Did he have all of his guys back together by this point?
Breckinridge?
No, Beauregard.
He had over 20,000 guys. He had over 20,000 guys together, but that's still a significantly smaller army than what he had on the day before.
Right.
From Beauregard's point of view, the course of the day will be one of slowly realizing that he cannot accomplish what he's trying to do. And then he moves the goalposts, changes his objective, and then slowly realizes he can't do that either. So in the early morning, he intends to win. He intended to just scoop up Grant, finish the battle. He thought he had won anyway, and then they'd go. Then he realized he would have to fight to win. Then he's, okay, we will attack and beat Grant. Okay, we can't do that. Then we will attack and maintain a stalemate and get away with a bunch of stuff. And then finally we can't do that either. By the middle of the afternoon, Buell is all here and they're driven from the camp.
That was around 3 o'clock.
That was around 3 in the afternoon, yeah. Hey, let's head forward to the Peach Orchard.
And he's been in the Mexican War, and so we parallel 2nd Kentucky. Someone wanted a furlough. Well, I was in Mexico for 12 months. I never had a furlough. I was in Mexico 12 months. I never went on sick call. And they got some of the regiment brought up to the I was in Mexico for 12 months.
Oh, you missed a copperhead there.
By 10 o'clock, the battle was definitely heating up in front of General Nelson's division, including the center of General Nelson's division, the 22nd Brigade, commanded by Colonel Sanders Bruce. And we are now in an area that would be the extreme right flank of Colonel Bruce's brigade and the extreme left flank of Colonel William B. Hazen's brigade of Nelson's division. Now, as we said at the last position, at the last stop, Nelson had a continual concern about his right, because the more his division advanced to the south, the more the Union Army was advancing to the south and west, thus leaving a gap on his right, and a gap the Confederates could fire down and flank him out of this position. So as he moved forward, more and more, the brigade of Colonel Hazen was redeploying and facing to the southwest, while the axis of advance for the whole division was more and more to the south. And the further that, with every step they took, the deeper that problem got for them. Now, as we spoke about at the last position, the 20th Kentucky, during this time period, was detached from the brigade to support Captain Terrell's battery. And indeed, they had a lot of some very exciting adventures on the other side of the Hamburg-Savannah Road. At one point, between 10 and 11, Captain Terrell advanced those cannons all the way to the other side of this field. He advanced his cannons right up to the skirmish line. And so for an hour or two that morning, Terrell was blasting the Confederate main line from very close range over there. The Confederates responded to that, and Terrell found his battery in a tough situation. They had to retreat from that position. It's an interesting story. In the battle, they retreated by prolong, which is an artillery tactic of where they could fire the cannons and then attach prolongs, ropes, to the cannons, and then pull them back, while some members of the crew would pull the cannon back, and while it was rolling, other members of the crew would recharge it and then drop trail and fire again. Now, anybody that's worked on artillery, like we've had artillery firing here yesterday, would know retreating by prolong would be very difficult. It would increase the chances of an accidental discharge by a whole lot. Imagine that number 3 guy who's supposed to put the thumb stop on the vent, and it's hard enough to keep it like, it would be like that. It would be like cannon. It's going to be right here. It's his right hand. Is it the right hand or the left? It's the left. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marvin. So imagine doing that walking, while the cannon is being withdrawn. Imagine ramming a charge home while the cannon is being withdrawn. But nevertheless, Terrell did that. He himself working one of the guns as they retreated, firing in the face of Confederate advance from probably Colonel Joe Wheeler's Alabama regiment and troops attached to him over there. And that would be what the 20th Kentucky was doing, supporting that and doing their best to support Terrell and fire upon those Confederates over there. That means these 2 regiments, the 1st Kentucky and the 2nd Kentucky, are pretty much responsible for this entire Peach Orchard front, with the 2nd Kentucky over there and the 1st Kentucky over here. But we also know that Lieutenant Colonel Enyart of the 1st has a different primary mission, which is that the 1st Kentucky must protect the left flank of the neighboring brigades left, right? And that's the 9th Indiana Regiment. So between about 10:30 and 11, the Confederates launched this large attack that we talked about as we walked up here. General Breckinridge launched his attack through the area of the Eastern Corinth and Hamburg Purdy Road, straight through here. So his right flank of that attack came moving right through this area. Even the right flank of the attack would have been where we could see it, kind of moving through these woods. Moved up, struck the center of Hazen's brigade, and then Crittenden's division to the right of that. And so imagine you're in the 1st Kentucky here. During that time, you'd be standing here, or perhaps laying here in line of battle, and you could see an enormous battle going on to your right. You couldn't do anything about it because your business is over there. But over here, an enormous battle going on. And then as those Confederates, as Breckinridge's line was driven back from the Union front, Colonel Hazen took his brigade and counterattacked. Colonel Hazen's brigade counterattacked and just charged right out of the line all the way through the Daniel Davis wheat field, and briefly captured a Confederate battery over there in a terrible hand-to-hand fight. So while that happened, Colonel Enyart and the 1st Kentucky of Bruce's brigade advanced. So they would have left this position and left this line of battle and advanced to the south and the west. So let's follow them down to the woods over here, okay?
From having a conniption with all this explosions going on and all that. I shot a .22 rifle off a horse one time and he went wild.
That's good. That is a good question, and I'm glad to see you in good, hale and hearty health after that experience.
Well, that's been years ago. I've only done it once.
The answer is, and Mona might be able to give us a better answer than I could, but the answer is they didn't, and the horses did have conniptions until after the horses had been trained. And if we speak specifically about the Union Army, but this would apply to the Confederate Army as well, I think. Once the Army was better organized, say after 1861, then not only are the troops in the field better at what they do, but the people in the rear and the organization is better at what they do. And they have training camps for the horses. And horses, so artillery camps they're assigned, an artillery battery is assigned 119 horses. So while the gunners are learning the trade of gunnery, the horse holders or postilions or teamsters are out training the horses
and the horse can be trained for all this.
Horse can be trained for that. I don't think the horse ever likes cannons going off in their ear, but they can be trained. Well, I'll let you. Let's hear what Mona has to say.
Herd animals too.
Yeah.
So if you have some experienced horses who are used to it, and they take these younger horses that are a little greener and hitch them with the experienced horses, they will follow lead of the lead horses.
So they'll remain calm.
Calmer, because these other horses are calm too, so I shouldn't flee. Those ones. But then if they try a lot of them, have them in the backside, they'll keep them in the back, like the quartermaster horses, and kind of get them used to behind the lines.
Yeah.
And then when they're kind of used, then they can move them up more to the front. But you got to remember, most all the battery horses, they dropped the cannon, the batteries were took to the back. The horses were took back off. And then
Right.
the
Well,
older horses.
if they thought they would need to move, though, they would keep the
They'd have them.
limber right to the back. We're talking about 100 yards.
Yeah, so
maybe.
just not too far back, but
Yeah.
back away. But then they still had home because there's some that did flee.
Right.
There's all kind of reports.
Of course, if we imagine if we remember or picture the experience of Myers Confederate Battery on the first day, we went through their camp down there, and Myers Confederate Battery was a new battery and a green battery, and they came and they deployed over here, and almost as soon as they deployed, the Confederates downrange were able to put a cannonball right through one of those limbers, one of those ammunition chests. And that ammunition chest exploded, and it killed men and it killed horses, and the men were green and the horses were green, and the entire battery just turned and fled. They just stampeded. Now imagine those, like I said, there's 119 horses assigned to a battery, but if you do the math, it's 72 to pull the 6 guns and then the 6 caissons, of the guns and the caisson. So imagine all of those horses and all of those batterymen, and the horses maybe still attached to their caisson, just bounding across the landscape and disappearing in that direction, running over people, running over the regiments that are coming up. So you see that kind of thing happen. Mm-hmm. Also, for artillery horses, the last thing we want to say about those is each of the artillery horse teams has a teamster. So that's a person, one of the men, a crewman. And so if you have 7 crewmen manning serving the gun, you have 3 other teamsters taking care of the horses that are standing by. And we call them teamsters. They would often call them postilions because they were crazy about French words, and the French doctrine that they had inherited from Napoleon and all. But one of the things that I think is most intriguing and impressive is the duty of those teamsters during the battle is to stand at the head of the team of horses and keep the horses calm. Now, obviously, if there's a lead horse that's calm, that does a lot to help. But their post in the line of battle is just behind the cannon, facing away from the enemy and standing at attention with the horse right here. And so their experience at the Battle of Shiloh is to stand just in the rear of the front line, facing away from the enemy, and just standing there.
How many horses did it take to pull a cannon and a caisson?
6 to pull the cannon, which had an ammunition chest.
Yeah, the caisson.
No,
6 to pull the cannon,
a limber.
which had a limber attached to it and an ammunition chest sitting on top of the limber.
I call
And
that
then-
a caisson.
No, the caisson's a different thing.
Okay.
Yeah. And then
That's a common conception.
it is a common conception. Yeah. And then another different vehicle called a caisson, carrying the reserve ammunition, that is being pulled by 6 more horses.
It's a caisson body, which has 2 chests and a spare wheel.
Right.
And it's attached to a limber, which has 1 ammunition chest.
Right.
That's why when you see them in funerals, they've taken all the ammunition chests off, and
Right.
the tire, of course, and put the casket.
And put the
right
casket right there
Right.
on the caisson.
But everything in a battery is attached to a limber. Your
Right.
battery wagon, your forge,
Mhm.
the cannons, everything.
Okay. Yeah. Everything's attached to a limber,
A limber.
and then the limber carries whatever.
Yeah, a little 2-wheel cart.
Right.
It's very.
Mhm.
So really, it's 12 horses for a cannon and all its supplies.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For
That's a
one
lot
cannon.
to keep up with.
It is a lot to keep up with, and it can create some really awful situations. And again, if we look at what happened to Burroughs Battery over there near the crossroads on the first day of the battle, where the Confederate Brigade, General Wood's brigade, came up and just shot down the horses, and then charged and took the battery. That was one of those scenes where you had these horses, dozens of horses, dead, piled upon each other, dead in their limber, dead in their traces. And that just had to create, then of course afterwards burned, piled and burned. One of the things that they had to deal with.
My impression is later in the war it became a common tactic. You want to take a battery, shoot the horses dead so they can't see it's drawn, and then take the battery.
Yeah, they mastered that tactic. Infantry mastered that tactic later in the war. Another reason why, to bring us back to our topic, why batteries must be supported by infantry. And by support, that means behind the horses with the caissons, a regiment of infantry usually lying prone in line of battle, not doing anything while the enemy down here is trying to bombard the battery, and all of the overshots are landing amongst the infantry that are supporting them. It was a frustrating duty, to say the least, to lay there not being able to do anything to defend yourself, and while the artillery just came pounding down upon you. All right, let's get back to the experiences of the 1st Kentucky Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel David Enyart. As we said before, his order was to stay linked to the 9th Indiana Regiment of Hazen's brigade. Hazen ordered an attack, a charge, and his entire brigade attacked to the south and the west across this cotton field, some to the left across this cotton field and through those woods and into the Daniel Davis wheat field. Enyart's regiment apparently, I say apparently but not explicitly by reading these reports, apparently followed the 9th Indiana behind them and to the left, not right up with them. But nevertheless, the 1st Kentucky attacked across this cotton field, got into these woods here, and engaged the Confederate main line of battle in these woods. And it was a bloody battle back over here. Enyart attacking, and then Hazen's brigade off to his right, off to the west, fighting hand to hand over the guns of the Washington artillery of New Orleans in the Davis wheat field. That hand-to-hand fight resulted in Hazen's men taking the cannon, and then the Confederates counterattacking, and in another hand-to-hand fight, driving Hazen's men away from those cannons and back through the Davis wheat field. So then Hazen's brigade came retreating as fast as they had attacked, retreating back across the field, and at that time Enyart's regiment, of course, also withdrew back to the other side of the field. They attacked across the field, had a bloody fight in this thicket here, and then retreated back to the area of the Mans George cabin. They did that on their own without any coordination with the other regiments of Bruce's brigade. And that, of course, left briefly a hole in the line, one would imagine. I don't have any reports of the Confederates over here taking advantage of that hole in the line, but we do have reports from Colonel Sedgwick saying that he had to send skirmishers off to his right to cover a hole in the line. So when you read the report, it can be a little confusing where Sedgwick says, I'm on the left and I had to do all this stuff to cover my right. My job was to hold the left of the line, and I kept having to cover my right. But this action would explain the problem that Sedgwick had, the reason why he had to cover his right, with the 1st Kentucky attacked in conjunction with Hazen, and it wasn't until they retreated that the line was restored. Now, let's take another move to the other side of the field here, where it starts to fall off into that ravine.
Question real quick.
Yeah.
This attack by the 1st was ordered by Nelson. Is Nelson ordered it?
Nelson would be the person that ordered it. Yeah, Nelson was actually sitting with Hazen when Hazen proposed to make the attack, and Nelson said go. And Buell was sitting with both of them.
Probably was an order coordinated kind of attack.
It would have been an attack by opportunity. Confederates attacked them. They drove the Confederates back. Here's an opportunity to hit the Confederates while they were retreating and drive right through it. But it violated the entire idea of the integrity of the line, which had been their you know, their main idea up until this time. So we do see this doctrine, this conservative doctrine that Buell is trying to maintain, falling apart as soon as they contact the Confederate main line of resistance. It harkens back to an aphorism that we hear over and over again that I first heard related to World War II, is that no plan survives contact with the enemy.
Wow. Yeah.
You know, and I think that's reflected here on the Shiloh battlefield, where Buell is trying to fight the most conservative battle he can, and as soon as he contacts the Confederates, everything blows up. Yeah. Further down the ravine, that's going to be an important dip in the ground that will be important to the interpretation of the fighting of the 2nd Kentucky in a while. We're not going to go down and go around. I want to go around the Confederate side of the line of battle. But this ravine, which moved down into what was a mule lot belonging to Sarah Bell, this ravine was played an important role, and here you can see it starting to fall down, to descend down there. Okay?
And apparently it did have a lot of rain, and I find that cold. So it's about the open out drive, but it needs to take an open out drive.
The last chapter of our program where we can look down into the ravine, because that'll be a little better illustration for us to talk about the fighting of the 2nd Kentucky Regiment on the afternoon. But nevertheless, this is the tablet that marks the position of Bruce's brigade at the end of the fighting when the battle is over. And there's a similar tablet just down the road that marks the position of Ammon's brigade at the end of the fighting, and another tablet down there that marks the position of Hazen's brigade at the end of the fighting. Very carefully planted, very neat and ordered arrangement of the tablets. And it doesn't quite tell the story of how those brigades got to these positions by the end of the battle. Nevertheless, there's accurate information here, so we can use that to orient ourselves to what, you know, the timeline of what's going to happen. And indeed the tablet reads, this brigade with its regiments in order as above, 2nd Kentucky, 1st Kentucky, 20th Kentucky behind them, was engaged near this place about noon, April 7th, 1862. It was driven back, but recovered the ground at 2 p.m. and bivouacked here on Monday night. Now, the attack by Hazen's brigade occurred, by my reading, somewhere in the 10:30 to 11 o'clock range. And so that attack may have taken up an hour of time, coming, fighting, and going. By the time they had returned to their line of battle, it might have been 11:30 or 12. And so when you talk about noon, the experience of the 1st Kentucky is more coordinated with what happened to Hazen's brigade than what happened later. But it's not too far off. We are talking about, you know, they would have returned, been repulsed in somewhere around 11:30, 11:15, 11:30, somewhere in there, returning to their line of battle. By my reading, it is after that is over that the next phase opens and the 2nd Kentucky makes its attack. Now, during all of this time, remember that General Hardee, the Confederate commander here, is defending his position along the Hamburg-Purdy Road using tactics of local attack. He's defending the position by attacking the Federals. And most specifically, most effectively, Hardee is using his right flank troops, the Mississippi Brigade under General James R. Chalmers, to attack through the ravines and through the woods where that same brigade had fought the previous day, to turn the left flank of Nelson's division and drive them back. And that was a constant thorn in Nelson's side. Not only did he worry about his right flank, as we've been talking about, because we've been tracing the center and right flank of his attack, but he had plenty to worry about from his left flank, as Colonel Amon sent all of these, reports that the enemy's turning our left flank. And so he has to find troops to go and support his left flank. And he does that by asking for reinforcements, and one regiment is detached from Crittenden's division. So Crittenden's division, the next division on the right, sends the 19th Ohio Regiment all the way across the rear of Nelson's division to report to Colonel Amon and extend his left flank. And now Amon has 4 regiments instead of 3, reaching on down. And then he needs to bring in more than that. And the troops he finally finds are troops from General Grant's army. Troops from General Grant's Army of the Tennessee, who've been detached because of the confusion of the previous day's fighting, been detached to the rear, advanced on their own under their commanders, asked General Buell or one of his staff officers, what can we do, where do you need us? And eventually they were detached to the far left of the Union line to finally secure that against the flanking maneuvers of General Chalmers. General Chalmers finally retreating to the Hamburg-Purdy Road, although he spent the entire day by flanking the Union left, spent the entire day preventing Nelson from advancing and taking this main line of defense along the Hamburg-Purdy Road. And in fact, Hardee definitely fought Nelson to a stalemate. During the morning and on through the noon hour. And that's pretty impressive considering the fact that from our point of view, we think maybe some of us have thought of the second day as a foregone conclusion. That Buell arrived, the Yankees counterattacked, and they were going to drive the Confederates away. Well, by noon, Hardee had managed to fight the Federals in his area to a stalemate. Now we're going to take one more look at one effort of Colonel Bruce's brigade to break that stalemate. Let's wait for our car to go by, and then we'll cross the 1862.
Boy, that wasn't long after this.
It wasn't long after this at all. No. Old Nelson, he was the guy who could make some enemies.
I can't remember what it was over.
I think
It was a pathetic personal disagreement. Jefferson Davis was a small, wiry guy with sort of, you might call it a Napoleon complex. Oh yeah. And he was quick to take offense, and big old Bull Nelson was always happy to give it.
I think it disparaged the conduct of the Union troops at Battle of Richmond, Kentucky.
Yes.
In Richmond,
And
Kentucky, yeah.
I think, as I recall, I haven't done this in years, that Davis accosted him over that, and Nelson threw like a calling card in his face. Get away from me, you damn puppy!
You call him damn puppy.
Yeah, and so then Davis goes and fires a revolver, and boom! Blows a hole in him. He
Yep.
dies a few minutes later.
Standing right in the foyer of the Galt House. Yeah, lobby area of the Galt House. Yeah. And Jefferson and General Jefferson C. Davis went on to command the 14th Corps.
I guess that his action wasn't deemed so terribly improper.
I just think
He had some friends. Yeah.
They just couldn't afford to prosecute him. I mean, he was, I think, indicted for murder, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a very interesting story on its own, and a historian named Rob Girardi has done talks about that are really interesting. And if I remember, Rob's conclusion was basically that they couldn't figure out whether this was a civilian or a military case, and then it bounced around, and then one side or the other had a time limit expire or grew tired of it. And on the military side, the war moved on. These court-martial officers were needed with their units.
And so was he.
And so was he. Yeah, so he just went back.
And the governor of Indiana was there too.
Yeah, Governor Morton.
Yep, that's probably the reason why he got away with it.
Yeah, Jeff C. Davis was in Indiana.
Yep.
Also.
Yeah.
Yep.
All right, hey, let's move on over by the Texas Monument.
Can I do something?
Things seem so
They really
organized and simple.
They
Yeah,
weren't here at this time. They were still over there.
they weren't here. Yeah, they weren't here during the fighting, during Enyard's fight, but they did come back over during Cedric's fight.
They did join back up.
Yeah, and by the end of the day, the tablet illustrates when they went to bed at night.
Right, so that's where they ended the day at.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Here's the clean skies, and then they have some downpour.
Going into the mule lot.
Anytime I get a chance when we have people out here, this terrain, this plateau, scours very easily. The drainage coming off of it really erodes the topsoil very easily. We are, a couple of 100 yards, 300 yards from where we came out of that open field where it was straight and level. And I said, hey, look down there at that little low ground. That's going to become a ravine. Well, that's the result at this point. And, less than a mile from here, it'll be 100 feet from top to bottom with sheer sides down where it backs up the position where Stewart was fighting on the first day. Geography plays a big part in this battle, and sometimes it plays a big part within a very short geographic distance between one place and another.
So how deep are Owl and Snake Creeks?
The channels themselves?
Yeah.
Well, it depends on where you are and how much rain is falling.
Just in general, if you went down to the bottom.
You'd probably be on the bottom in, 4 or 5 feet?
In places.
Yeah, in places. One of the things about those creeks is they'll stop an army. They won't necessarily stop an individual soldier who doesn't mind getting wet, from crossing it. But, as the protection to the right flank or left flank of an army, they're very effective because the cannon can't go through there, and
you can't get large numbers.
Through there, right? But yeah, I'd say 4 or 5 feet in most places, and then with a lot of bottomland, so you might wade through mud up to over your ankles for 100 yards before you get to the channel, that kind of thing. Yeah. All right. At about the time, and I'll admit here I'm guessing, an educated guess, just derived from the reports of Colonel Bruce and his subordinates, at probably about the time that the first Kentucky regiment was falling back, the 2nd Kentucky regiment was going to make an attack. The 2nd Kentucky regiment made an attack toward the position where we are now. Now, one of the reasons why it's tough to nail down the timelines of any of these things is part of the reason is General Hardee's tactic of defending this position by attacking the other side. And one of the famous episodes from the second day of the battle occurred about this time in about this place. And that is when General Hardee sent Colonel Moore and his Texas regiment ahead to attack the Federals on the other side of this field. And we have our Texas Monument behind us here somewhere. It's placed where it is to commemorate the fight of Moore's regiment. And Moore made that attack, but Moore, I think the attack was earlier rather than later, and it's for this reason, the Moore was told that when he was moving forward, he would be behind General Breckinridge, who was already making an attack. So let's imagine, I think we can imagine with a lot of confidence, that Hardee was sending Moore to support Breckinridge's attack, which is around 10, 10 to 11. So this could have been a little earlier, or it could have been behind that, or their timeline could have been off. Breckinridge might have already been driven back when Hardee gave the order for Moore to go ahead. But Hardee told Moore, you have friends up there, don't fire upon your friends. You're walking up to the back of a Confederate line of battle, not to the end. And so Moore marched his regiment right out there, right up to the Union line of battle, which may well have been the 2nd Kentucky Regiment, or it may have been the right flank of Ammon's brigade. He was probably astride the road from Savannah to Hamburg. And they marched right up to the Union line of battle, and the Union line of battle fired right into the faces of the Texas Regiment. And the Texas Regiment, the men started screaming, no, no, we're friends. And the officers screamed to the men, no, don't fire, they're your friends. And then the Federals shot them again. And the men started to fall back, and they started to break ranks, and then they rallied, and the officers tried to rally them, and some of them started to shoot back, and a staff officer from Hardee came up waving his pistol around and says, if anybody shoots their guns, I'm going to kill him. And then the Federals shot him again. And finally, the 2nd Texas broke and retreated in disorder back across the Peach Orchard and down to the Mule Lot and up to the main line of battle. And this led to a post-battle controversy that lasted for a long time between General Hardee and Colonel Moore and his Texas Regiment, his 2nd Texas Regiment. And that boiled all the way up, especially with the influence of Texas Senator Louis Wigfall. And that brought the Texas Senator and Jefferson Davis into the controversy over whether the 2nd Texas Regiment ran away and disgraced the state of Texas, or on Moore's side, whether they were sent into a trap and made to stand there and get shot down and murdered by the Yankees by their incompetent Major General Hardee. And that is a controversy that lasted for a long, long time. Now, nevertheless, Moore would already have been driven back to this position by the time Colonel Bruce sent Colonel Sedgwick across the Peach Orchard and the field there to take Confederate cannons in this area that had been firing upon them all morning long. So all morning long there were Confederate artillery here, there was Confederate artillery further down the Hamburg-Purdy Road. There was the Washington Artillery Battery that was engaged in that hand-to-hand fight with Hazen. There was artillery all along this Confederate main line of resistance, continually pounding the Federals during the morning. And Nelson only ever had those 2 batteries, Mendenhall and Terrell, to respond to this artillery. However, Nelson did say of Captain Terrell and his battery, Captain Terrell's battery were a host unto themselves. He was so impressed with Terrell's work that he thought that Terrell alone had done a great job of suppressing the Confederate cannon fire coming from this ridge. Nevertheless, by the time Moore has been driven back, by the time Moore was driven back, Colonel Sedgwick got his 2nd Kentucky Regiment together and attacked this position. And they attacked this position. They came down into the ravine here, and both Sedgwick and Captain Smith, Captain Jake Smith, who we talked about before, noted that the Confederate artillery was on the ridge behind firing, while the Confederate infantry protecting the artillery was hiding in the ravine in front. It's quite uncommon during the Civil War for artillery to fire over the heads of their own infantry. That's something they don't usually do. But in this case, the infantry, we can see, could hide down in the ravine, and probably feel that they were protected from their own artillery firing behind them pretty well. Still, Sedgwick attacked, and as near as I could tell, Sedgwick and the 2nd Kentucky attacked alone. Across the field there, down into the ravine, which we call the Mule Lot, down into the ravine, and there they engaged in a vicious, close-quarter, face-to-face combat with the Confederates supporting the cannons up here. And at least 2 of our sources call the fighting practically hand-to-hand, meaning that both sides were fighting within just a few feet of each other, and it also seems that the organization of the regiments was not perfect elbow-to-elbow lines of battle, but that the men were all mixed up together, blue and gray, shooting at each other from point-blank range, loading and firing. Captain Smith saw his 2nd Lieutenant Miller killed right there in front of him, and other officers went down. Colonel Sedgwick was wounded in the fighting, and it was a very vicious fight, but eventually the Kentuckians drove the defending infantry back out of the ravine. They drove them out of the ravine, then they quickly reorganized into a line of battle, and they attacked. They called it up a small hill. They said, we attacked up the small hill, attacked out of the ravine, came all the way up to the Hamburg-Purdy Road, and they took the cannons. Or at least they said they took the cannons. They also admitted that as soon as they took the cannons, Confederate reserves from the other side of the road counterattacked, and in another vicious close-quarter fight, drove them from their cannons, drove them from the Confederate cannons, back down in the ravine, back up, and then they retreated all the way back to the peach orchard. Again, showing that on the larger scale, that Hardee is fighting Nelson to a stalemate here on the eastern edge of the battlefield. So after that repulse, all of Sanders' Bruce Brigade is now back where they started. They're all back in the peach orchard. After about another hour or so, at least according to our tablet here, the fighting to the west of us, the fighting of General Crittenton, the fighting of General McCook, the fighting of General Grant's army that happened to the west of us, started to drive the Confederates back, started to drive back the Confederate left, the Confederate western flank, driven back almost to Shiloh Church. This factor compelled General Hardee to order all of the troops along this position that had held the Union left to a stalemate, to retreat from this position to the south and to the west. And as they retreated, again, Nelson moved forward, and again, they crested this hill where they finally took the Confederate position that they'd been fighting all morning. They took an empty position, already evacuated by the Confederates. All they tell us after that is by the time they took the position, several times they said they saw Confederate cavalry riding to the right in front of them. They characterized it as an attack, so they fired at the Confederate cavalry, and the Confederate cavalry continued riding away as they had been, and Nelson's men took credit for repulsing yet another attack on their line. But from the comfortable chair of hindsight, we can say by the time all of that happened, the battle on the eastern side of the battlefield was at an end. And the Confederates retreated to the west and the south to make their last fight right around the Shiloh Church on the west side of the battlefield. Between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the battle on General Nelson's front was at an end. And as Mona asked, when did the 20th Kentucky come back into the fold? It was basically, as the battle was ending, Captain Terrell's battery was detached from from this left side of General Nelson's division and sent to the right side of General Nelson's division and eventually into Crittenden's area to fire upon the Confederates as they were retreating to the south and west. And the 20th Kentucky went pretty far to the west, but then eventually came back and joined Bruce's brigade at this point. And that brings us to the end of the Battle of Shiloh for Bruce's brigade. We have time for a little bit of what came after, because it is pretty interesting stuff. Of course, from the point of view of the military history of the brigade, they continued to serve on through the siege of Corinth. They continued to serve in General Nelson's division. And without being able to point out any of the specifics, we can see a continually deteriorating relationship between Colonel Sanders Bruce and General William Nelson. They're supposed to have had a real rocky relationship, and whether it was personal or not, by the end of the summer, one of the things that Sanders Bruce definitely wanted to do was to get himself and his men back to Kentucky. Now, he wanted to get himself back to Kentucky for the reason that Kentucky was engaged in its own internal civil war at the time. Of course, by the late summer, Morgan is up in Kentucky riding around, creating all sorts of problems. Bruce's kinsman, Morgan, is riding around creating all sorts of problems. So Bruce needed to get back there, and Bruce wanted his 20th, and the best way to do that is get the whole 20th Kentucky detached from the army and sent back to Kentucky. And so there they were, and while I looked up the post they were guarding, I've forgotten it now, but it was one of the little towns in the Bluegrass, and they spent this time in the rear area dealing with the internal civil war. Now, as a garrison commander, we also know that Sanders Bruce created all sorts of problems for the people he had authority over. He was not an easy person to work for, or to be under someone else's influence. He did have, at some time during the summer, he lost his good, robust health. He's thought to have suffered a stroke. And so he spent a long time disabled and on the disabled list. But neither did he resign his commission. He continued commanding his post. The last time we see him is almost a comic situation. When later in the war, I believe it's when General Burbridge has taken over in Kentucky, General Burbridge relieves Colonel Bruce of his command, and we see in the correspondence Colonel Bruce responding with, "Thank you for relieving me of my command. I only need to stay for a few weeks to get a few of my things together." And then a few weeks later, General Burbridge saying, "No, seriously,
Get out.
You're fired. You need to go away now." "Oh, I just need a few more days to get my affairs." "No, your affairs don't need to get in order. I fired you. You need to go away now." And finally, that does lead to Colonel Bruce detaching from the army. We can see simply, without getting any of these details that we don't necessarily, that I don't have here for you, that we have a colonel who was commanding a brigade at the Battle of Shiloh, which was a Union victory, and for which his brigade really contributed a lot, that never received any promotion to brigadier general. So he did the job of a brigadier general for most of his career, and he never got that promotion. What that says or doesn't say can only be inferred, but I think one of the inferences we could make is that nobody above Sanders Bruce wanted to see him promoted to brigadier general. Anyway, Bruce himself, Mona already knows more about Bruce and his writing than I do, but he himself went back to his pre-war career of breeding horses, and he was one of the great authorities on agriculture and breeding of thoroughbred horses. And so that's where he sits. He actually holds a position in history in another phase of history, with much more success doing that than what he did in the Army. Another after the war story that is very interesting is that of Captain Smith, Captain Jake Smith, commanding Company A of the 2nd Kentucky Regiment. Captain Smith went to the regular Army and stayed in the Army for his entire career. It was a career highlighted by a series of courts-martial for various offenses that he always seemed to skirt. The guy was like a watermelon seed. When you pressured him, he squirted sideways, and he was gone. And so he continued through one controversy to another to serve in the regular Army throughout his career. And by the time we get to the period of the Philippine insurrection, Captain Jacob Smith of the 2nd Kentucky is now Brigadier General Jacob Smith of the U.S. Army. And he served in the Philippine insurrection in the early 1900s. He commanded American forces on the Philippine island of Samar, where he earned the title the Butcher of Samar. And so he advanced from captain, the captain of Company A, wounded here in this final conflict that we talked about, the fight down here in the ravine. He advanced from being a captain and a hero of the Republic at Shiloh to being a much criticized and largely loathed American colonial administrator in the Philippines, the Butcher of Samar. Now, I can't get too deep into the Samar controversy, but there's a controversy over how many people he murdered. But if we accept that he murdered people while attempting to put down local rebellions on the island of Samar, that he murdered enough to gain the name, the Butcher of Samar, we know he did that job as he understood his job there pretty well. And so Smith ends up his historical career with mixed marks, to say the least, which is also characteristic of Colonel Bruce and General Nelson. Quite possibly one of the most interesting brigades at the Battle of Shiloh. We have the commanding general murdered. We have Sanders Bruce with all of his foibles, and we have a captain who ends up being an oppressive administrator of U.S. colonial rule in the Philippines. And then we have the rest of the men in the brigade. Let's remind ourselves who these men were. They were definitely Kentuckians, or at least they identified themselves as loyal Bluegrass Kentuckians. They may not have been remembered so by their neighbors after the war, nor were they thought of themselves when they crossed the Ohio River to join the Yankees in 1861. Yes, I'm talking specifically about the 1st and 2nd regiments here, not the 20th. And this was a memory that these guys would have had to deal with for the rest of their lives. And some of them might have pulled up stakes and moved to Ohio or moved west like a lot of other people did. And indeed, they would have had to deal with a culture, a political and social culture in Kentucky that changed drastically after the war. Kentucky was a slave state. Kentucky, if you look at the politics of the pre-war era, Kentucky had a very strong Whig sentiment before the crash of the Whig Party, but also a very strong Democrat sentiment and a very strong conservative political view, which meant in that time a very strong pro-slavery political view, except for individuals that were strongly anti-slavery. This is why they needed Bowie knives wherever they went, whenever they went to the market. But we had a state that was coming into the war was very conservative and very pro-slavery, and even when emancipation came, of course, as I think we probably all know, when emancipation came, it only emancipated the slaves in there were areas in rebellion. Therefore, assuring the slaveholders of Kentucky and the power in Kentucky, Missouri, and Maryland, and Delaware, that their property would not be molested and that they would get to keep living their lives just as they had. Well, then the 13th Amendment came along. And even before the 13th Amendment came along, the federal government came into Kentucky and started recruiting African-American soldiers for the United States colored troops. And all of these loyal, conservative, slaveholding citizens were, wait, what were we promised? What were we promised for our loyalty in 1861? And so more and more, when the war ends, the people of Kentucky started to remember the war not as the triumph of Unionist Kentucky, but more akin to what we call the lost cause story of Kentucky. And if one was looking at the post-war memory of Kentucky, we would have seen the Kentuckians from the Orphan Brigade, the survivors of the Orphan Brigade, exalted as the great Confederate heroes of Kentucky, and the men of the 1st and 2nd Union Regiment, more or less, we would have seen them robbed of their identity of Kentuckians and remembered as being, scoundrels and rivermen and cutthroats who had to run away across the river and join Yankee regiments rather than being real, true blue Kentuckians. Now, that's a story that goes on for 150 years. But I'll simply summarize it with the observation of the historian Avery Craven that Kentucky was the only state that seceded after the war ended.
Right.
There has recently been a fine book called Creating a Confederate Kentucky by a scholar named Ann Marshall, and I recommend it highly, that traces the post-war evolution of Kentucky from a patriotically Unionist state to a memory of Kentucky 150 years later as a true blue Confederate state. Nevertheless, that happened later, and that does bring us to the end of our program on Bluegrass Confederates here fighting in the Peach Orchard. If we've learned anything from it, it would simply be that nothing is as simple as it seems to be at first glance. Now, we have a few minutes to take questions, so let's jump right into a Q&A, and I know that Henry has one on his mind.
Well, you brought up an issue that made me think, what happened to these white landowners who had slaves and supported the Union, like in Kentucky?
Yeah.
And okay, in the end, and when it's all said and done, they have to give up their slaves because of the 13th Amendment. Mm-hmm. Well, they must have taken a terrific financial loss in that case. Were they promised reimbursement by the government, or
no, they weren't.
Anything?
No, they weren't. And they did take a tremendous financial loss, but also, like their former slaveholding cohorts in the former Confederate states, they made adaptions. And so their response to the liberation of their former property, their former chattel, was to begin, because they were still powerful men,
yeah,
if not rich anymore, they're still powerful men, to start to begin the institution of new laws that complied with the 13th Amendment, but nevertheless put those who were formerly enslaved back into a position where they would have to continue to do the labor
the Jim
that
Crow
they did.
laws.
That's right. The Jim Crow laws would affect Kentucky just as they did the former Confederate states. And so you see a number of things happen, and one of them being the growth of the what we might call the prison industries in the South during the time that we later see in the chain gangs going around, fixing roads or being used to help private farmers on their land or something like that. If you could come up with laws that would put African American men who were formerly, liberated from slavery into jail, that skirts the 13th Amendment, because the 13th Amendment says if you've been convicted, that
What if they didn't justify being put in jail?
It don't make
They
no
found
difference.
that wouldn't have made
They
any
didn't
difference.
steal anything or whatever.
Well, if someone said they stole something, someone who wanted them to work for them, things started to get pretty hypocritical. That's the nature of Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Bending reality to try to place the liberated bondsmen, the former slaves who are now liberated, back into a state of servitude for practical purposes.
I thought that Lincoln had made a couple offers to the border states to purchase the price of the
they said
slaves.
Yeah,
And
they're-
they said no. So why did they say no? Why didn't they accept the money then?
Well, you have an opinion on that, Kurt? You can pitch in if you want.
Race.
But, yeah.
I think race, I think race, and I think the idea people just don't want to accept what they don't want to accept.
Right.
I think.
And I would add to that, let's also remember the faith that the conservative Kentuckians placed in their president, in the promise of their president, Lincoln, that their rights would be respected. Remember, the 13th Amendment occurs just a couple of months before Lincoln died. So we're talking about people who had a strong faith in the promise that Lincoln had made on January 1st, 1863, that emancipation would not affect them and their property. And then for the next 2 years, they held strong to that faith, and then suffered because of that faith.
But I thought
And
they had
you
made
can
the
see how
offer
that would-
before the 13th Amendment.
Oh yeah, they did.
Well,
It
the
was absolutely-
offers
they
came
were-
even before emancipation.
Oh, yeah.
Part of
The offers came after that,
the negotiations
Yeah.
that Senator Crittenden
Right.
engaged in involved the idea that would have extended to the states that later, seceded as well, or that were involved in the secession crisis as well. And these offers were turned down. These offers were spat upon when the offer of the government purchasing the freedom of slaves were made. The people who were in a position to sell said no deal.
We'd rather keep them. We don't want.
Yeah, and I think they had faith that that promise would be respected, and then it wasn't.
They
And
didn't
I
see
think
the
that
writing on the
contributes to a deep skepticism among those kinds of people about the federal government and their promises following the war.
I suspect also that most of the major slaveholders had Confederate sympathies. I suspect it went like it did throughout the South. Those with the strongest slaveholding class were much more likely to be Confederate than to be loyal to the Union.
Quite possibly.
So I suspect if we looked into it, we'd find. I haven't
Quite
looked
possibly.
into
Well,
it,
we'd have to unpack that. That would probably apply to the Hunts and the Morgans,
Right.
but it didn't apply to Cassius
It didn't apply
Marcellus
to
Clay.
anybody. That's right. There are always exceptions.
And but I think you're right. I think because from the point of view of the economy, the capital, the power of the people that had money was always going to try